Robb Stark had always felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him, though he had never realized just how different his life might have been if the smallest choices had gone another way. In this reality, the fateful Red Wedding never happened. Instead, the whispers of treachery reached Robb's ears in time, carried by a loyal servant who had sensed the malice in Walder Frey's heart. The news came like ice through his veins, yet he remained calm, a wolf among sheep, plotting every move with a patience that would have made even his father proud. The bannermen, sensing the unshakable certainty in his eyes, rallied behind him without hesitation. The betrayal that had once shattered his house now became the crucible that forged him into something far stronger, far more dangerous than the boy who had once led troops at 20 years old. He became a king not just in name, but in presence, a shadow over the riverlands that no enemy dared challenge. From the moment he turned Frey's own halls against him, Robb's reputation as the unstoppable Wolf King began to spread. Word traveled faster than wildfire, reaching the ears of the Lannisters, who had assumed the North would fall like a candle snuffed by winter's cold. They were wrong. Robb's cunning was not brute force alone. It was strategy, timing, and the cold calculation of a mind honed by loss and pain. He did not waste his fury recklessly. Frey men were trapped before they even realized the snare had been set. Robb's army moved like shadows, striking decisively and vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. Each victory bolstered his legend, drawing in allies who had once feared the North's decline. Lords who had been neutral or hesitant saw a wolf that could not be stopped, and they bent the knee or swore oaths in the hope of surviving the inevitable tide. But Robb's rise was not merely military. He understood that a king without a realm under his control was a king of ghosts. Winterfell became a fortress of loyalty and law, not just a symbol of Stark pride. The small folk whispered his name with reverence, and songs began to circulate in taverns from White Harbor to the Neck, tales of the young wolf who had outsmarted betrayal and built a kingdom from the ashes of near defeat. He ruled not with fear alone. He ruled with the sense of justice that had always defined his house, tempered now with a cold edge that warned traitors that mercy was a luxury he would no longer indulge. Those who tried to deceive, cheat, or undermine him found themselves undone in ways both subtle and terrifying, their ambitions crushed before they could fully take root. In these early years, Robb's legend was solidified not through blind conquest, but through a blend of honor, strategy, and the occasional ruthless action that reminded everyone of the wolf beneath the crown. Robb's personal life, however, was never simple, and the specter of love always threatened the delicate balance of his rule. Talisa had survived, and together they had become a formidable pair, her strength and wisdom complementing his determination. Their love was not naive, it was forged in fire, tempered by the realities of war and politics, but even the bond they shared could not shield them from the dark corners of intrigue. The North and Riverlands were safer under Robb's hand, but whispers of unrest persisted in the shadows of King's Landing. Cersei Lannister, still ruling in her ruthless, venomous way, saw in Robb not just a threat, but a blemish on her family's legacy. She plotted endlessly, sending assassins, poisoners, and spies, each more desperate than the last. Robb, however, anticipated them all. Years of surviving betrayal had honed his instincts to a supernatural edge. By the time Cersei's machinations reached the North, they were already obsolete, undone by counterintelligence, loyal spies, and a network of informants who moved through the shadows as efficiently as wolves moving through a forest. Robb's army, once young and untested, matured into a machine of relentless precision. The Knights of the Vale, sworn to the late Jon Arryn's family, recognized in him not just a king, but a commander whose strategy rivaled the great tacticians of Westerosi history. Battles that had once ended in bloody stalemate now ended with Robb's forces standing victorious, often with minimal losses. His banners, stark against the winter sky, became a symbol of inevitability. To fight him was to invite disaster, to oppose him was to vanish like smoke in the wind, and yet Robb remained humble, at least in appearance. He did not parade his victories nor boast of his conquests. Instead, he let his actions speak, and the whispers of the people, the common folk, the soldiers, even the enemies, carried his name far beyond the borders of the North. Even across the narrow sea, news of the unstoppable Wolf King reached the ears of Daenerys Targaryen. the mother of dragons, ambitious and proud, saw in Robb not a potential ally but a rival. Here was a young king who had unified his lands and commanded loyalty through respect and fear alike, a king whose reputation could rival the Targaryens' claim to destiny. Yet unlike the dragons, Robb relied on human skill, intelligence, and cunning. He was not a creature of fire and destruction, but a predator who used the world's chaos to his advantage. When the first of Daenerys' emissaries arrived in the north under a banner of diplomacy, they found themselves negotiating with a king whose mind was as sharp as Valyrian steel. Robb Stark, the unstoppable wolf, was not impressed by the promise of dragons. He saw opportunity, strategy, and the delicate balance of power, weighing every word and every gesture with the precision of a master chess player. As winter deepened, Robb's legend only grew. From the Iron Islands to the Stormlands, tales of his victories became the currency of awe and fear. Yet he was not a tyrant. He was a king who understood the duality of power, the need for respect, and the necessity of ruthlessness. Betrayal was punished swiftly and visibly, but loyalty was rewarded generously. His bannermen prospered under his protection, knowing that their success was tied directly to the strength and cunning of the Wolf King. Even the harsh winter, which had broken lesser kings, seemed to bend in his favor. He had learned from the direwolves as much as from men, patience, cunning, timing, and he applied these lessons with relentless consistency. But the greatest test of all came not from armies or foreign queens, but from within his own blood. Sansa and Arya, once scared children hiding in the shadows of power, emerged as advisors and warriors in their own right. Sansa's cunning rivaled any courtier in King's Landing, and Arya's lethal skills kept Robb's enemies wary even when they thought themselves safe. Together, the Stark siblings formed a triad of influence and power, their family bond a force that few could penetrate. The Wolf King was not alone. He was the head of a pack whose reach, influence, and determination were absolute. And as he stood atop Winterfell's battlements, watching the snow fall over the lands he had saved and united, he realized something profound. He had become more than a survivor of betrayal. He had become a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable, a wolf whose howl would echo across Westeros for generations. With the Riverlands securely under his control, Robb Stark understood that his victory was only the beginning. Winning a battle or defeating a traitor was one thing. Ruling and consolidating power across a fractured land was entirely another. The Freys had been crushed, their castles burned or seized, and the surviving lords who had once whispered treachery now knelt before him, their faces pale with fear and awe. Yet Robb knew that fear alone could not maintain a kingdom. He needed loyalty, and he sought it through both fairness and shrewd manipulation. He traveled across the Riverlands, speaking directly to the small folk and their lords, showing them that he was a Stark not just by name but by action. Justice was swift and visible. Robbers, corrupt stewards, and those who abused the people were punished publicly, while those who served with honesty and courage were rewarded with lands, titles, and protection. In this way, Robb began to stitch together a web of allegiance stronger than any sword could create, binding the Riverlands to the north not through fear alone, but through respect and calculated trust. Even as he consolidated power, Robb remained aware of the ever-present threat from the Lannisters. Tywin Lannister, a man renowned for his cold, methodical genius, had initially dismissed Robb as a boy who had narrowly escaped a massacre. That miscalculation would cost the Lannisters dearly. Robb's spies infiltrated the southern lands, uncovering hidden alliances, secret movements of troops, and weaknesses in the Lannister armies. Every maneuver he made was deliberate, a game of shadows played across the breadth of Westeros. When the first Lannister envoy arrived at Riverrun under the guise of diplomacy, he found himself outmaneuvered at every turn. Robb, the unstoppable wolf, spoke with a calm authority that belied the tempest of strategy whirling in his mind. Offers of alliance were made, subtly laced with threats that left the envoys sweating and unsure, while any hint of deception on their part was met with immediate consequences back in King's Landing, from destroyed caravans to exposed plots against his allies. The Lannisters, for the first time in years, realized that they were facing a foe they could not intimidate, a wolf whose patience and cunning outmatched even Tywin's legendary tactics. As his influence expanded, Robb turned his attention to the Vale. Lord Petyr Baelish, ever scheming, had anticipated the North's vulnerability and moved quietly to extend his influence. But Baelish had underestimated the unity and foresight of the Stark siblings. Sansa, now grown into a sharp-minded and calculating advisor, recognized every whisper of betrayal and every subtle hint of ambition. Arya, fierce and lethal, acted as both shield and dagger, eliminating threats before they could fully materialize. Together, the siblings created a network that ensured no secret could pass unnoticed. When Robb himself entered the Vale under the guise of negotiation, he did so with the confidence of a predator among prey. Lords who had been loyal to the crown were swayed by promises of protection, land, and mutual prosperity, while those who attempted treachery found themselves outmatched in games of both mind and combat. The Vale, once a region of uncertainty and potential rebellion, became an extension of Robb's influence without a single large-scale battle, a testament to his ability to turn cunning and patience into power. Yet it was not merely the lands and armies that Robb needed to master, it was the people themselves. He had learned from the Red Wedding that betrayal often came not from enemies alone, but from those closest to him. The lessons of trust and vigilance guided every interaction. He cultivated loyalty in subtle ways, rewarding acts of courage and cunning, while quietly observing those whose hearts held ambition or deceit. His bannermen came to respect him not as a boy king, but as a man whose understanding of loyalty and strategy surpassed even the most seasoned lords. Even the smallest victories, the protection of villages from marauders, or the fair resolution of disputes among minor lords, added to his reputation. The people of Westeros began to speak of Robb Stark not as a Stark of Winterfell alone, but as a king who embodied the strength and cunning of a wolf in every action, whose presence promised safety for allies and doom for enemies. Meanwhile, the Lannisters were not idle. Tyrion, ever sharp and calculating, attempted to counter Robb's influence through diplomacy and subterfuge, but he found himself repeatedly outwitted. Robb anticipated the movements of his enemies before they were fully conceived, and every attempt to undermine him backfired, further solidifying his reputation as the unstoppable Wolf King. Even Tywin, watching from King's Landing, realized that the boy he had once dismissed now wielded a power that could rival the Iron Throne itself. The balance of Westeros was shifting, and no one could ignore the growing force of the North and its allied regions. Robb's victories were not merely military, they were psychological, breaking the confidence of enemies before the first sword was drawn. In his personal life, Robb's bond with Talisa deepened, tempered by the trials of rule. Their love was no longer a simple passion of youth, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. Talisa's insight into the hearts of men, her ability to see motives and hidden agendas, became invaluable to Robb's reign. Together, they balanced the harshness of war with the subtlety of governance, blending the compassion of the North with the necessity of ruthlessness. Their children, still young, were being raised under the principles of honor, vigilance, and cunning, embodying the next generation of Starks who would continue to shape the fate of Westeros. As Robb's power grew, so did the challenges. Rival houses, emboldened by fear or resentment, began to test the limits of his influence. Yet each challenge was met with calculated precision. Ambitious lords found their rebellions quashed before they could gain momentum, and treachery was met with consequences so swift and unavoidable that whispers of disloyalty became impossible to sustain. Robb Stark was no longer merely a ruler of men. He was a force of nature, a wolf whose presence reshaped the political landscape of Westeros. Every lord, every bannerman, every soldier understood that to oppose him was to risk complete annihilation. But even as he solidified his rule, Robb remained aware that his greatest threat was yet to come. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen's power continued to grow, and her dragons cast long shadows over every plan he made. He understood that the time would come when diplomacy alone could not suffice, and the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale would face an enemy unlike any before. Robb prepared quietly, training his armies, strengthening his intelligence network, and honing strategies that would allow him to survive against fire, steel, and ambition alike. In every decision, every movement, he thought like a wolf, calculating and patient, ready for the moment when the full weight of his power would be unleashed. Winterfell had become more than a castle. It was the heart of a kingdom, a center of vigilance and strategy. Robb Stark, the unstoppable Wolf King, ruled not just with armies and banners, but with the sharp edge of intelligence, the loyalty of his people, and the quiet, unyielding force of a wolf who had learned from betrayal and loss. Every victory, every alliance, every conquered threat added to his legend, and Westeros was beginning to understand that the boy who had once been almost murdered at the Red Wedding was now a king whose reach and power were limitless. His story was no longer one of survival alone. It was one of dominance, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of strength, and the echoes of his name were beginning to reshape the future of the entire realm. The first true test of Robb Stark's unstoppable rise came when Tywin Lannister, furious at the repeated humiliation of his bannermen and the loss of the Riverlands' loyalty, decided to strike personally. He marshaled the Lannister forces with a precision only a man of his reputation could achieve, believing that sheer numbers and the threat of his army would finally bend the North and its allies to his will. But Robb had anticipated this. He had spent months studying the Lannisters' tactics, training his commanders, and building fortifications along key routes that would funnel their armies into traps of his design. When the Lannister host first appeared beyond the green hills of the Riverlands, Robb's scouts reported every movement, and he positioned his forces with the quiet confidence of a predator who knows the terrain as well as the behavior of its prey. What Tywin had expected to be a swift march of intimidation turned into a lesson in strategy, as the Northmen and their allies struck with the efficiency of a pack of wolves, cutting off supply lines, ambushing forward scouts, and striking vulnerable flanks with devastating precision. First engagement at the crossing of the Red Fork was a decisive blow. The Lannister vanguard, composed of seasoned knights and mercenaries, believed they could overwhelm the northern forces with their experience and heavy cavalry. Yet Robb had prepared the ground, turning the riverbanks into a maze of trenches, hidden archers, and barricades designed to channel the enemy into kill zones. When the attack came, the Lannisters found themselves mired in mud, ambushed from all sides, and unable to coordinate effectively. Robb himself rode at the center of the battlefield, his presence a rallying force for his men and a harrowing sight for his enemies. Each command he gave was measured, every maneuver perfectly timed. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the Lannister vanguard lay broken, scattered, and demoralized. Tywin Lannister, observing from afar, realized for the first time that Robb Stark was not merely a clever boy, but a tactical genius capable of outmaneuvering even the most experienced commanders. The victory, however, was not just military, it was psychological. News of the Lannister defeat spread quickly, and the influence of the North and the Riverlands expanded even further. Small lords who had once hedged their bets now openly pledged allegiance to Robb, sending troops, resources, and oaths of loyalty. Even some southern lords, who had long feared the wrath of King's Landing, quietly sought alliances with the young Wolf King, knowing that resistance would be costly, if not fatal. Robb's reputation grew not only as a fighter, but as a ruler who understood the delicate balance between fear and respect. He punished those who had betrayed him, yes, but he also rewarded courage and loyalty, ensuring that those who followed him did so not out of mere obligation, but because they saw in him a leader worth serving. His network of spies and informants now stretched into the heart of Lannister lands, ensuring that every whisper of rebellion or conspiracy reached his ears before it could take root. Even in the midst of war, Robb never lost sight of his family. Sansa and Arya remained at Winterfell, shaping policy and advising him on matters both political and personal. Sansa's ability to read courts and navigate the subtle currents of power complemented Robb's battlefield genius, while Arya's lethal skill provided a silent, deadly assurance that no traitor or assassin could act against him without consequence. Talisa, ever his confidant and partner, continued to provide counsel rooted in human empathy and insight, reminding Robb that a kingdom was built not just on victories and strategy, but on the lives and trust of the people who lived within it. Together, they formed a center of influence that extended beyond the battlefield, a network of minds and hearts as formidable as any army. As the war continued, Robb began to extend his influence deeper into southern territories. The Freys had been crushed, the Riverlands stabilized, and the Vale secured. Now the Westerlands and the Reach became the new targets for his calculated expansion. He did not rush blindly into conquest, knowing that overextension could be fatal, but each move was deliberate and methodical. Supply lines were secured, intelligence networks strengthened, and alliances carefully negotiated or coerced. Robb's army became not just a force of steel, but a mechanism of fear and respect, moving with precision and striking with lethal efficiency. Each battle was a lesson for his enemies, each victory a reminder that the Wolf King's reach was inevitable. Even as Tywin regrouped in King's Landing, he knew that confronting Robb directly would be disastrous. The boy who had survived the Red Wedding was no longer a boy. He was a force of nature, a predator whose cunning and ruthlessness rivaled the greatest strategists in Westerosi history. Yet despite his growing power, Robb remained vigilant. He knew that ambition often breeds betrayal, and he had no illusions about the lengths his enemies would go to reclaim their dominance. Assassination attempts became more frequent, and intelligence reports warned of secret alliances being forged in the shadows, but Robb was ready. Arya intercepted would-be killers with silent precision, Sansa uncovered schemes before they could be enacted, and Robb himself used misinformation and strategic deception to neutralize threats before they could harm him. Every move, every countermeasure was calculated, ensuring that he remained several steps ahead of his rivals. The Wolf King's legend grew not only because of victories in open battle, but because of his uncanny ability to anticipate danger and neutralize it before it materialized. Amidst these campaigns, Robb also realized the importance of symbolism and morale. He ensured that the banners of the North flew proudly across captured lands, not just as markers of conquest, but as emblems of security and order. Festivals, public hearings, and displays of justice reinforced his image as a ruler both fair and formidable. He encouraged the local lords to administer their lands efficiently, punishing corruption while rewarding loyalty and competence. The people who had once feared war and chaos now began to see Robb Stark as a protector as much as a conqueror. The stories of his victories, his cunning, and his leadership spread far and wide, transforming him from a boy king into a mythic figure, a wolf whose influence stretched across the entire continent. As winter deepened, Robb's thoughts inevitably turned to King's Landing itself. The Iron Throne, held by the cunning and ruthless Lannisters, remained the ultimate prize. He understood that even with his current victories, the Lannisters would continue to plot and scheme, and a final confrontation was inevitable. But Robb was no longer a reactive player. He was proactive, anticipating every move, every alliance, every betrayal. His spies whispered secrets from the streets of King's Landing, his envoys tested loyalties in the Reach and Westerlands, and his armies were trained and ready for the campaign that would finally bring the Wolf King's influence to the heart of the realm. He was no longer merely surviving. He was shaping the destiny of Westeros itself, every decision carefully calculated to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no force capable of standing against him. And through it all, Robb Stark remained true to the principles of his house, tempered now by experience, loss, and the unrelenting logic of survival. Honor guided his decisions, yes, but pragmatism shaped his methods. He was a king who understood that love, loyalty, and fear were tools as powerful as any sword, and he wielded them with unmatched precision. The unstoppable Wolf King was no longer a legend whispered in fear. He was a living, breathing force whose presence reshaped the political, military, and social landscape of Westeros. And as he gazed northward from the walls of Winterfell, watching the snow drift silently across the land he had reclaimed, he knew that the next chapter of his story would test not only his mind and his armies, but the very fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Robb Stark's rise had been swift, and yet he knew that true power required more than victories on the battlefield. It required mastery over the minds and hearts of men. By the time his reach extended to the outskirts of King's Landing, the young Wolf King had become a figure whose name alone could change the course of conversations, alliances, and even rebellions before they began. His spies moved freely within the capital, hidden among merchants, servants, and even disgruntled soldiers. Every whisper of treachery reached him before it could blossom into action, and he learned quickly that the court of the Iron Throne, despite its gilded halls and golden banners, was a place of constant danger. Tywin Lannister had anticipated confrontation, but he had not anticipated a king so young, so intelligent, and so patient that he could see the patterns of betrayal before they occurred. Robb's strategies were not brute force. They were a web, subtle, intricate, and impossible to escape once woven, capturing both the ambitions and the fears of those who believed themselves untouchable. As Robb prepared his campaign for influence in the south, he was acutely aware of the growing shadow cast by Daenerys Targaryen. The tales of her dragons, her conquests across the narrow sea, and her growing army of Unsullied had reached even the most remote corners of the north. Where once he might have dismissed them as mere rumor, Robb now studied her carefully, analyzing every decision she made from afar, predicting her intentions based on the patterns of ambition and temperament he had learned to read in men and women alike. He did not fear her fire or her dragons, but he understood that to confront her unprepared would be reckless. He began to cultivate allies along the southern coasts, sending envoys to free cities and ports to gather information, trade, and influence, all while quietly building a network that could support him in a future conflict should her forces ever reach Westeros. It was a patience born of experience, a wisdom that came not from age, but from surviving betrayal and death itself, lessons seared into him by the horrors of the Red Wedding that had never come to pass in this timeline. Inside King's Landing, the Lannisters grew desperate. Tywin, frustrated by his inability to intimidate or outmaneuver Robb, relied on his children to execute more subtle manipulations. Cersei attempted to exploit fear, spreading rumors of spies and assassins supposedly loyal to the Wolf King, hoping to fracture the loyalty of his southern supporters before he even set foot near the capital. Jaime, though less politically astute, was ordered to harass supply lines and border territories, aiming to disrupt Robb's network before it became fully operational. Each move, however, played into Robb's hands. His scouts had already mapped supply routes, observed troop movements, and infiltrated key locations, ensuring that the Lannister machinations were neutralized before they could gain traction. Ambushes along trade routes, sudden strikes on poorly defended castles, and carefully timed feints destabilized Tywin's plans. By the time the first armies of the Westerlands advanced toward the Riverlands, they found themselves confronting forces that seemed to anticipate their every move, as if Robb Stark had a hand inside Tywin's own mind. At the same time, Robb focused on the human element of his strategy. He understood that fear alone could not sustain loyalty. Respect and opportunity were equally important. Lords who had long doubted the North's resilience were given the chance to rise under his command, rewarded for skill, bravery, and cunning. Villages under his protection prospered, trade flourished along routes secured by northern and Riverlander forces, and even southern bannermen who had once opposed him began to see the benefits of allegiance. Robb's network of spies and informants expanded into a force that rivaled any standing army in influence, and his ability to predict threats and exploit weaknesses became the stuff of legend. His reputation as the unstoppable Wolf King was no longer merely a tale whispered in the north. It had reached the ears of every corner of Westeros, and even the distant lands across the narrow sea spoke of a boy king whose cunning and precision were unmatched. Amid these political and military maneuvers, Robb's family remained his anchor. Sansa, always attuned to the subtleties of courtly intrigue, advised him on negotiations, interpreting the hidden meanings behind every proposal, every gesture, every choice of words. Her ability to read the intentions of others was invaluable in navigating the treacherous waters of southern politics, where even small slights could spark rebellion. Arya, whose skill with stealth, combat, and intimidation had become unmatched, acted as Robb's silent protector and enforcer. Her presence ensured that those who plotted against him, even in secret, would be swiftly neutralized. Talisa, steadfast and wise, reminded Robb of the humanity behind rulership, tempering his strategic ruthlessness with compassion when necessary, ensuring that he remained a king who inspired devotion rather than mere fear. Together, the Starks formed a triumvirate of influence and power that reshaped Westeros, blending military might, political acumen, and human insight into a force that few could hope to counter. The first direct encounter with Tywin's forces near Harrenhal was a testament to Robb's brilliance. Rather than meeting the Lannisters head-on, he orchestrated a series of maneuvers designed to weaken their resolve and fracture their alliances. Supply lines were cut with precision, false intelligence fed to generals eager to impress Tywin, and sudden strikes against isolated contingents created confusion and panic. Robb himself moved along the front lines not to intimidate, but to inspire, his presence a steady, commanding force that reinforced the loyalty of his men while sowing fear and doubt among his enemies. By the time Tywin's main force engaged, it faced not a single army, but a network of forces acting in concert, each attack timed perfectly, each position strategically chosen. The Lannisters suffered a devastating defeat, their losses compounded by the betrayal of allies who had secretly pledged themselves to Robb, recognizing his unstoppable momentum. In the aftermath of Harrenhal, Robb's influence in the south grew exponentially. Houses that had long been indecisive or opportunistic now sought his favor openly, pledging their support in the hope of survival and prosperity. Merchants and traders, once wary of northern expansion, began to move goods freely under his protection, increasing the wealth and resources at his disposal. The network of loyalty and intelligence that Robb had cultivated allowed him to consolidate power in a way that few kings in Westeros had achieved, blending fear, respect, and opportunity into a single, seamless strategy. Even across the narrow sea, news of his victories reached Daenerys, forcing her to reconsider her plans and the timing of her invasion. The boy who had once been almost slaughtered at the Red Wedding was now a king whose strategy and foresight rivaled the greatest rulers of history. Yet Robb remained vigilant. He knew that every victory, every alliance, and every maneuver drew the attention of new enemies, both known and hidden. The Game of Thrones was never static, and power could shift in a single night. He continued to study every detail, every whisper, every movement, ensuring that no threat went unnoticed. His army grew stronger, his influence broader, and his legend deeper with each passing day. Robb Stark, the unstoppable Wolf King, had transformed Westeros not merely through battles, but through intelligence, patience, and the quiet, inevitable force of a wolf whose shadow stretched across every corner of the realm. And as he stood on the battlements of Harrenhal, watching the sun set over lands that had once seemed distant and hostile, he understood that his journey had only begun, and that the greatest challenges and the greatest triumphs still lay ahead. By the time Robb Stark turned his attention fully to the southern kingdoms, his reputation as the unstoppable Wolf King had spread like wildfire across Westeros. The Lannisters, already reeling from repeated defeats, could no longer project authority beyond King's Landing, and even their most loyal bannermen began to question whether continued resistance was worth the cost. Robb's strategy had shifted from defense to expansion. He understood that power was as much about momentum as it was about loyalty. The Riverlands and Vale had been consolidated, the north secure, and southern lords increasingly sought his favor, eager to align themselves with a ruler whose cunning and strength were now legendary. Yet the shadow of Daenerys Targaryen loomed across the narrow sea, and Robb knew that her arrival would bring a test unlike any other. Dragons were not mere beasts, they were instruments of mass destruction, and the woman who commanded them had ambitions that could destabilize everything he had fought to build. But Robb did not fear her. Instead, he began preparing, using intelligence, alliances, and unconventional tactics to ensure that when the Targaryen threat arrived, he would face it not as a boy king reacting to fire and fury, but as a master strategist controlling every variable. Robb's first step was to understand the strengths and weaknesses of Daenerys' forces. He sent envoys to Essos under the guise of trade and diplomacy, learning the routes her armies would likely take, the cities where she might gather support, and the temperament of her generals. Each piece of information was scrutinized, analyzed, and incorporated into a strategy that balanced patience with precision. Robb did not intend to meet her in open battle immediately. He knew dragons could annihilate armies if misjudged. Instead, he sought to create a web of influence and intelligence within the cities of the southern coast, turning potential allies into informants and potential enemies into neutralized threats. By the time Daenerys' fleet approached Westeros, Robb Stark had already anticipated nearly every move she could make, positioning his forces, resources, and loyal lords to confront her with minimal risk. The first skirmishes along the southern coast were unlike any battles Robb had previously fought. Scouts reported sudden, coordinated attacks on landing parties, supply caravans, and mercenary groups, all carried out with the precision of a well-trained army operating as a single mind. Robb's reputation as a wolf who anticipated his prey had been solidified. His enemies never knew where he would strike, and by the time they realized the trap, it was already too late. Even the dragons, those mythical beasts of fire, were rendered less effective through careful preparation. Robb's engineers had designed defensive structures, trained specialized archers, and created deceptive terrain that forced her forces into vulnerable positions. Each engagement reinforced his legend, proving that the Wolf King's cunning could neutralize even the most overwhelming power when applied with intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. As the Southern campaign unfolded, Robb also relied heavily on the human element of war. The loyalty of his bannermen, his army, and even minor allies became a force multiplier. He rewarded cunning, bravery, and insight, while punishing treachery swiftly and visibly. Lords who attempted to hedge their bets or play both sides found themselves stripped of lands, titles, and influence, serving as examples to others who might question his authority. The people under his protection, meanwhile, prospered, seeing stability and security in a world long plagued by chaos and betrayal. This balance of fear, respect, and opportunity became Robb's greatest weapon, and it extended beyond mere military strategy into the hearts and minds of all who lived under his influence. No longer was he simply a king commanding armies. He was a presence, a force whose shadow reshaped the entire political landscape of Westeros. When Daenerys finally arrived with her dragons and her unsullied army, she was met not with fear and submission, as many had expected, but with calculated resistance designed to exploit every vulnerability. Robb had anticipated that she would rely heavily on her dragons and disciplined forces, and he had prepared both traps and diversions. River crossings were sabotaged, supply lines cut, and ambushes coordinated to strike the Unsullied when they were most vulnerable. He utilized terrain, weather, and the precise timing of attacks to offset the advantages of fire-breathing beasts, creating situations where dragons could not dominate without risk. Even when the dragons unleashed their fury, Robb's forces were prepared with fire-resistant materials, trenches, and strategic formations, allowing them to minimize casualties while maintaining pressure on Daenerys' troops. The battles were brutal, intense, and deadly, but every engagement ended with Robb's forces gaining the upper hand. Throughout the Southern campaign, Robb's family remained central to his strategy. Sansa continued to coordinate intelligence and diplomacy, turning minor houses into allies and ensuring that each region responded to his commands as a unified whole. Arya's lethal precision eliminated assassins, infiltrators, and saboteurs, neutralizing threats before they could compromise his plans. Talisa maintained communication with the people, keeping morale high and ensuring that the common folk saw the Wolf King as a protector, not a tyrant. Together, the Stark family became an inseparable network of influence, a combination of strategy, skill, and human insight that allowed Robb to face challenges that might have overwhelmed even the greatest of kings. As the campaign progressed, Daenerys' initial confidence began to falter. Her dragons, though powerful, were not omnipotent, and her army, though disciplined, was worn down by the relentless, strategic attacks orchestrated by Robb. Her advisors warned of underestimating him, yet she struggled to adapt to a foe whose tactics were both unconventional and highly effective. Robb anticipated her moves, forcing her into situations where she had to choose between risk and retreat, and every decision played into his advantage. The young Wolf King's patience, intelligence, and ruthlessness became clear not only to his allies, but to the Targaryen forces themselves, creating a sense of inevitability that no fire or steel could counter. By the time the decisive engagement took place near the outskirts of King's Landing, Robb had mastered the art of war in both mind and execution. His forces moved with coordination, precision, and relentless determination, striking at the exact points where Daenerys' army was most vulnerable. Even when confronted directly with dragons, he used terrain, timing, and tactical ingenuity to minimize their threat, while maximizing the psychological impact of his maneuvers. Every attack reinforced his legend, turning the unstoppable Wolf King from a figure of myth into a reality whose presence dominated the battlefield, the minds of allies and enemies alike, and the fate of Westeros. In the aftermath of the Southern Campaign, Robb Stark's dominance over the Seven Kingdoms was all but assured. Daenerys, recognizing his unparalleled skill, chose negotiation over open confrontation, and even the most skeptical Southern lords acknowledged the inevitability of his rule. The North, Riverlands, Vale, and now the Southern Territories were united under a single, intelligent, and unyielding authority. Robb's legend, built on cunning, strategy, loyalty, and ruthlessness, had become unstoppable. His name inspired fear, respect, and awe in equal measure, a testament to what a boy who survived betrayal, learned from loss, and mastered both mind and steel could achieve. With the Southern Kingdoms effectively under his influence and Daenerys Targaryen forced to negotiate rather than conquer, Robb Stark turned his focus toward the monumental task of ruling Westeros. Victory on the battlefield had secured him power, but holding it required a far more delicate balance of diplomacy, strategy, and vigilance. The Iron Throne, long a symbol of fear and ambition, was now a tool in his hands, but he understood that sitting atop it was not enough. The people of the Seven Kingdoms had seen kings come and go, many of whom ruled through terror or weakness, and Robb's challenge was to demonstrate that the unstoppable Wolf King was both formidable and just. He began by establishing governance structures that reflected both the strength of his rule and the wisdom he had gained from years of survival. In every conquered or allied territory, local lords were given responsibilities and autonomy, but under the strict supervision of Northern and Riverlander officials whose loyalty had been proven beyond doubt. He understood that loyalty bought with fear could crumble the moment strength faltered, but loyalty earned through respect and mutual benefit was far more resilient, and he carefully cultivated it in every corner of his kingdom. The Lannisters, though weakened, were still a looming threat. Tywin, humiliated repeatedly by Robb's victories, continued to plot in King's Landing, attempting to rally remaining allies and recruit mercenaries for a counteroffensive. Cersei, bitter and relentless, spread propaganda to undermine the Wolf King's legitimacy, portraying him as a usurper who had taken the realm by brute force. But Robb was always several steps ahead. His spies, positioned throughout the capital and even in the shadowed corners of Westerosi courts, reported every whisper of rebellion and every movement of gold or troops. He struck preemptively, exposing conspiracies, bribing influential courtiers, and leveraging his victories to sway undecided houses. Tywin's machinations were neutralized not with armies, but with intelligence, deception, and strategic displays of power, leaving the Lannister patriarch increasingly isolated, frustrated, and ultimately powerless to challenge the Wolf King's authority. At the same time, Robb focused on winning the hearts of the people. Westeros had endured years of war, betrayal, and oppression, and many of its inhabitants were weary, distrustful, and skeptical of rulers who promised stability yet delivered suffering. Robb addressed this not with speeches or empty promises, but with action. Villages ravaged by raiders were rebuilt under his supervision, and merchants found safe passage and fair trade under his protection. Justice was meted out visibly, punishing those who exploited or harmed the innocent while rewarding acts of courage, honesty, and loyalty. The common people began to see him not merely as a king, but as a protector, a force whose strength ensured that they could live without constant fear. These efforts reinforced his legitimacy, making rebellion not only dangerous but morally questionable, as even minor lords recognized that opposing the Wolf King was now a choice fraught with both risk and dishonor. Robb's family continued to be his greatest asset in this complex web of power. Sansa, now fully recognized as a master of courtly influence, managed political relations with a deftness that rivaled even the most experienced Southern advisors. She negotiated alliances, mediated disputes, and ensured that Robb's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Arya, whose lethal skills remained unmatched, operated both openly and in secret, eliminating threats before they could emerge and instilling fear in any who considered betraying the Wolf King. Taliesin, steady and wise, maintained the human touch, reminding Robb that while strategy and strength were vital, the people he ruled needed hope, care, and a sense of purpose. Together, they formed a network that combined intelligence, enforcement, diplomacy, and empathy, making Robb's reign nearly unassailable and reinforcing the idea that the unstoppable Wolf King was a force no enemy could fully predict or overcome. The Southern Lords, once skeptical of Northern power, quickly learned that aligning with Robb was safer and more profitable than opposing him. The Reach, the Westerlands, and even the Stormlands saw his influence grow as he redistributed authority, ensured fair governance, and rewarded loyalty. Robb's approach was methodical. He would not crush houses that submitted willingly. Instead, he absorbed them into his network, offering them power and protection in exchange for service. Those who resisted or plotted were swiftly neutralized, not always through open battle, but often through strategic manipulation that left them isolated and vulnerable. This approach reinforced the perception that Robb Stark was both merciful and relentless, a ruler who rewarded intelligence, loyalty, and courage while punishing deceit and treachery without hesitation. Even the surviving Lannisters were forced to recognize his supremacy. Tyrion, ever clever, attempted to advise the family on subtle maneuvers to regain influence, but each attempt was anticipated and countered. Robb's intelligence network ensured that every potential plot, every attempted betrayal, and every whisper of dissent was neutralized before it could take root. Tywin himself, constrained by his age and humiliation, could do little more than watch as the Wolf King consolidated power, his vision of dominance over Westeros shattered by a ruler who had mastered not only armies and strategy, but the very psychology of power. The Lannisters, once the architects of fear in the realm, had become pawns in Robb's calculated expansion, their pride and resources slowly eroded by his relentless foresight. Meanwhile, Robb faced the delicate challenge of Daenerys Targaryen's lingering presence. Though negotiations had prevented open conflict, her dragons remained a potential threat, and her ambitions could not be dismissed entirely. Robb continued to monitor her closely, using spies, diplomacy, and careful displays of military readiness to keep her in check. When emissaries from Essos arrived to test his intentions, they were met not with arrogance, but with calculated engagement, showcasing both his respect for power and his refusal to yield authority. Robb understood that the Wolf King's strength lay not only in his ability to fight, but in his capacity to control perception, influence decisions, and maintain an image of inevitability that kept both allies and enemies cautious and respectful. The consolidation of Westeros also required internal vigilance. Minor rebellions, attempts to exploit local disputes, and opportunistic factions cropped up across the Seven Kingdoms. Robb addressed these with the same combination of intelligence, precision, and ruthlessness that had defined his rise. Each rebellion was crushed efficiently, often before it could gain traction, and the leaders of these movements were either absorbed into his governance or removed permanently. The message was clear. The Wolf King tolerated no challenge to his authority, yet loyalty and competence were recognized and rewarded. This combination of justice, fear, and strategic generosity further solidified his image as a ruler whose dominance was both inevitable and respected, leaving Westeros with little room for doubt about where true power now lay. By the end of this period, Robb Stark's rule over the Seven Kingdoms had become unassailable. The Lannisters, humbled and diminished, could no longer project power. Daenerys Targaryen, impressed and wary, deferred confrontation, and the Southern Lords, increasingly loyal, recognized the benefits of aligning with a king who combined intelligence, strength, and justice in equal measure. Robb had transformed Westeros not merely through conquest, but through governance, psychological mastery, and strategic foresight, demonstrating that the unstoppable Wolf King was more than a military force. He was a ruler who understood the very essence of power itself. As he looked out from the Red Keep, watching the banners of his allies fly proudly across the capital, he felt the weight of responsibility, the inevitability of challenge, and the satisfaction of knowing that the boy who had survived betrayal, who had learned from loss and honed his mind as sharply as any blade, had become a king whose influence would shape the realm for generations to come. Even after consolidating the Seven Kingdoms, Robb Stark understood that ruling Westeros was far more complicated than winning battles or subduing rival houses. Power demanded constant vigilance, particularly in a land where ambition, envy, and old grudges never truly slept. The Lannisters remained a simmering threat, their pride wounded, but their cunning intact. Tywin, despite his diminished position, still sought openings to reclaim influence, while Cersei whispered in the ears of minor lords, sowing seeds of doubt and resentment. Yet Robb anticipated every move. His network of spies, informants, and loyal bannermen stretched from Winterfell to Dorne, leaving no corner of the realm beyond his scrutiny. Any hint of treachery was detected early, neutralized with quiet precision, and often transformed into an opportunity to expand his influence. This relentless vigilance reinforced his reputation. Even those who sought to oppose him learned that the Wolf King's reach was absolute, and defiance could end in ruin long before armies clashed. Beyond the Lannisters, Robb faced the delicate challenge of balancing the diverse interests of the Seven Kingdoms. Houses in the Reach, the Stormlands, and Dorne were used to ruling themselves with relative autonomy, often ignoring the decrees of distant kings. Robb, however, combined the carrot and the stick with unmatched skill. Loyal lords were rewarded generously with lands, titles, and trade privileges, while those who showed hesitation or ambition at the wrong moment were carefully sidelined or quietly removed. He encouraged merit over birthright in many cases, promoting commanders and administrators based on skill rather than lineage, a move that strengthened his armies and governance structures simultaneously. His decisions demonstrated to all that the Wolf King's rule was fair, but unyielding, blending respect and fear into a dual tool that ensured the loyalty of both lords and commoners alike. Robb's control over Westeros was reinforced through strategic marriages and alliances, not merely for appearance, but as instruments of power. He strengthened ties with previously neutral or rebellious houses, often marrying off Stark family members or loyal bannermen to secure bonds that could not easily be broken. These unions were carefully calculated, each serving both a political and symbolic purpose, demonstrating that Robb was a ruler whose influence extended beyond mere conquest. Even the southern kingdoms, once wary of the north, recognized the benefits of alignment. They gained protection, opportunity, and stability under the Wolf King, making rebellion both risky and morally questionable. His reputation as an unstoppable force was cemented not by fear alone, but by the undeniable reality that his rule brought tangible benefits alongside consequences for disloyalty. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen remained a presence on the horizon, a reminder that even an almost unassailable king could face threats from afar. Though negotiations had prevented direct conflict, Robb remained wary of the Mother of Dragons. He studied her tactics, monitored her armies, and maintained covert operations in Essos to anticipate any attempt she might make to cross into Westeros again. He treated her not as an enemy to be defeated immediately, but as a potential rival whose ambitions required careful management. His patience, foresight, and intelligence ensured that when confrontation eventually came, he would meet it on his own terms, turning what could have been a catastrophic threat into a calculated opportunity to further solidify his dominance. The internal security of the kingdom was equally critical. Even as Westeros appeared unified under his rule, minor rebellions and conspiracies persisted. Old grudges, ambitious minor lords, and disaffected soldiers tested the edges of his authority. Robb addressed these not with reckless brutality, but with a combination of intelligence, subtlety, and strategic punishment. Leaders of attempted uprisings were exposed and eliminated in ways that served as warnings to others, their fates carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological impact without destabilizing the realm. By the time word of these actions spread, the idea of challenging Robb Stark had become synonymous with self-destruction. Loyalty, competence, and courage were rewarded. Deceit and betrayal met swift consequences. This balance solidified his rule and reinforced the perception that the Wolf King's dominion was both unbreakable and just. Robb's personal life also reflected the demands and pressures of kingship. Taliesin remained his anchor, guiding him with wisdom and ensuring that his decisions accounted for human consequence, not merely strategic advantage. Sansa managed court politics with precision, mediating disputes and ensuring that the Southern Lords felt both respect and fear toward the Stark family. Arya's presence continued to serve as both deterrent and protector, her lethal skill making the very idea of treachery against the Wolf King a perilous endeavor. The Stark siblings together embodied a new model of rulership, combining intellect, enforcement, diplomacy, and empathy into a network of power that made Robb nearly invincible in both perception and reality. Even as he dealt with domestic concerns, Robb sought to leave a lasting legacy. He reformed taxation, ensured fair justice, and rebuilt infrastructure destroyed during the decades of war. He focused on trade routes, river crossings, and ports, securing economic prosperity alongside political stability. The North, Riverlands, and Vale had already prospered under his guidance. Now he extended these policies to the southern kingdoms, creating a sense that under his rule, life was safer, fairer, and more prosperous than it had been under any previous monarch. This strategy ensured that even those who might be tempted by rebellion weighed the tangible benefits of submission against the inevitable failure of resistance. The final challenge, however, remained the perception of Robb's legitimacy. Westeros was a land steeped in tradition, where ancestry and history often outweighed merit. To overcome this, Robb made symbolic and strategic gestures. He honored the traditions of each region he ruled, participating in ceremonies, respecting local customs, and acknowledging the authority of minor houses under his supervision. Yet he did so while reinforcing the primacy of his own rule, blending respect for history with the assertion of unstoppable authority. In this way, he turned potential criticism into a demonstration of wisdom, showing that the Wolf King was not only strong and cunning, but intelligent, adaptable, and capable of ruling all 7 kingdoms effectively. By the end of this period, Robb Stark's position was secure. The Lannisters had been neutralized, Daenerys remained in check, and minor rebellions had been crushed or absorbed. The 7 kingdoms, once fractured and divided, had been transformed into a realm united under a single, strategic, and unyielding ruler. Robb's blend of intelligence, ruthlessness, diplomacy, and foresight had created a kingdom where loyalty was both earned and enforced, where fear and respect coexisted in balance, and where rebellion was not merely dangerous, it was suicidal. The Wolf King's legend now extended across the continent, inspiring awe, fear, and admiration alike, and he understood that the challenges of the future would be met not merely with armies, but with the same unrelenting strategy, patience, and precision that had carried him from the near-death at the Red Wedding to the unchallenged ruler of Westeros. As he stood atop the walls of the Red Keep, gazing at the banners of his allies and the cities under his protection, Robb felt the full weight of his responsibility. He was no longer a boy shaped by tragedy. He was a king defined by intellect, strategy, and relentless action. The 7 kingdoms were his to protect, guide, and command, and the Wolf King understood that the future of Westeros depended not just on his power, but on his wisdom in wielding it. For the first time in his life, Robb Stark knew that he had become truly unstoppable, not only as a warrior, but as a ruler whose influence and strategy would shape the fate of the realm for generations to come. Robb Stark stood on the battlements of the Red Keep, his eyes scanning the sprawling city below, yet his mind was never at rest. Though Westeros had been brought under his authority and the Southern Lords had bent to his rule, he understood that true kingship was a constant balance of vigilance, strategy, and perception. Power could be lost as quickly as it was gained, and he had learned from the near tragedies of his past that overconfidence was the greatest enemy of any ruler. Every move he made, from granting lands to punishing a minor betrayal, was calculated not just for immediate effect, but for the long-term stability of the realm. The streets of King's Landing were alive with whispers, some in awe of the young wolf who had conquered the South, some in fear of the unstoppable force he had become, and others still quietly plotting their chance to challenge him. Robb welcomed it all. These whispers were a map of the hearts and minds of his people, and in knowing them, he controlled more than armies. He controlled the very pulse of the kingdom. He often reflected on the lessons that had forged him into the ruler he now was. The betrayal of the Red Wedding, though it had been avoided in this timeline, still haunted him in memory and in strategy. He understood that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be tested, earned, and observed constantly. His bannermen, while largely loyal, were reminded through subtle displays of strength and fairness that obedience was not optional, and that Robb's favor was both precious and conditional. Villages and towns that had previously suffered under corrupt lords were rebuilt under his supervision, not merely as acts of charity, but as demonstrations of the stability and prosperity that came from allegiance to the Wolf King. These actions created a network of support among the common folk that rivaled the influence he wielded over the nobility. People spoke of him not only as a king, but as a force of protection and inevitability, and that perception alone ensured that rebellion would always be a dangerous gamble. Robb also recognized that the greatest threats were rarely on the battlefield. The political machinations of the Southern Lords, lingering Lannister ambitions, and the distant threat of Daenerys Targaryen required constant attention. He maintained his intelligence network as the heart of his power, stretching from the free cities of Essos to the smallest castles of the Reach and Westerlands. Spies reported every conversation, every secret meeting, and every minor shift in alliances, allowing Robb to act before threats could materialize. The effectiveness of this network was enhanced by Arya's covert operations. Her presence ensured that any attempt to assassinate or sabotage him was swiftly neutralized, often before it could even be conceived. In every aspect of his rule, Robb combined force with foresight, blending visible authority with invisible influence, creating a system where even those who plotted against him were often manipulated into serving his goals unknowingly. At court, Robb's presence was magnetic yet calculated. He spoke rarely, but each word carried weight. Sansa's influence ensured that diplomacy and perception were as powerful as armies, turning potential rivals into allies and neutralizing threats through conversation and subtle psychological maneuvers. Tallis's counsel grounded him in empathy, reminding him that power could be absolute yet still humane if wielded with intention. Together, they maintained a delicate balance, strength tempered by wisdom, ruthlessness countered by fairness, and fear reinforced by respect. These principles allowed Robb to rule not just as a conqueror, but as a sovereign whose authority was accepted and even admired by those who had once resisted him. The Stark family, united and formidable, had become a central force of Westeros, their combined influence shaping every decision, every alliance, and every move of the realm. Even as Robb solidified internal governance, he prepared for threats from beyond the horizon. Daenerys Targaryen's presence in Essos remained a persistent concern. Though negotiations had delayed open conflict, he never underestimated her ambition or the power of her dragons. Robb studied her strategies from afar, predicting likely movements, and used intermediaries to sow doubt and misinformation among her allies. His army was trained not merely to fight, but to counter dragons, to use terrain, traps, and tactics that limited the impact of her fire and force. Every engagement he imagined in his mind became a rehearsal for a future battle, where strategy, foresight, and patience would ensure that his forces remained dominant even against an enemy with overwhelming power. In this, Robb demonstrated that the Wolf King's true strength lay not only in his command of armies, but in his ability to anticipate, adapt, and neutralize threats before they could manifest. Across the Seven Kingdoms, Robb's consolidation continued in subtle but powerful ways. He integrated previously independent houses into his governance, often marrying key allies into the Stark family or promoting loyal bannermen to positions of authority. He implemented standardized taxation systems, restructured trade routes, and stabilized regions that had been neglected for decades. His reforms ensured that his influence reached even the furthest corners of the realm, binding lords and commoners alike into a system that reinforced both loyalty and prosperity. This careful attention to governance was a force multiplier, allowing him to project authority without relying solely on military might. The perception that Robb Stark controlled the realm and that his rule was just, intelligent, and inevitable became as powerful as any army he commanded. Yet even as the realm stabilized, challenges persisted. Minor factions continued to test boundaries, opportunists attempted to exploit weakness, and old grudges simmered quietly beneath the surface. Robb addressed each with a combination of foresight, subtlety, and ruthlessness. Some were neutralized through persuasion or incentives, others through strategic displays of force, and a few were removed entirely from the political landscape. Each resolution served a dual purpose, securing his authority while sending a message to all that the Wolf King's control was not to be questioned. The result was a kingdom that appeared stable and unified, yet remained flexible enough to respond to threats and dynamic enough to grow under the guidance of a calculated, intelligent ruler. In his private moments, Robb reflected on the magnitude of what he had accomplished. From a boy nearly destroyed by treachery to a king whose influence stretched across Westeros, his journey had been forged through survival, strategy, and relentless determination. Yet he understood that the throne was never truly safe, and that power, even when seemingly absolute, demanded constant vigilance. His mind remained sharp, always considering the next potential rebellion, the next diplomatic challenge, and the next unforeseen event that could destabilize the realm. This awareness, combined with his family's unwavering support, ensured that Robb would never be caught unprepared, and that his rule would endure not merely through force, but through a sophisticated mastery of strategy, loyalty, and perception. The Wolf King's legend continued to grow, spreading across cities, villages, and battlefields alike. Stories of his victories, intelligence, and ruthlessness were told alongside tales of his fairness and protection of the people, creating a reputation that inspired awe, loyalty, and fear in equal measure. Westeros, long a land of fractured kingdoms and endless war, now knew a ruler whose presence alone reshaped the political, social, and military landscape. Allies felt security under his banner, enemies hesitated before action, and the common people learned that loyalty to Robb Stark was rewarded with protection, stability, and prosperity. The Wolf King had achieved not only domination, but the careful, calculated management of a complex and dangerous realm, a feat unmatched by any ruler before him. And yet Robb remained vigilant. He understood that power was never static, that even the strongest kings faced threats both visible and hidden. The lessons of his near-death experiences, of betrayal narrowly avoided, and of battles fought to the last man were never forgotten. Every decision, every alliance, every display of strength or mercy was part of a larger strategy to ensure that Westeros remained under his control. The unstoppable Wolf King had become more than a legend. He had become a force whose intellect, ruthlessness, and foresight would continue to shape the realm for generations. He knew that challenges remained, that threats would arise, and that every day required careful management, but he faced them with the calm confidence of a ruler who had survived the impossible and emerged unstoppable. Robb Stark's reign as the unstoppable Wolf King reached heights few in Westeros had ever imagined. The Seven Kingdoms, long fractured by betrayal, war, and ambition, now stood under his firm, calculated authority. His enemies had been either neutralized, absorbed, or forced into submission, and even distant threats like Daenerys Targaryen had come to respect the precision and inevitability of his rule. Yet it was not fear alone that ensured his legacy. It was the combination of intellect, strategy, and the careful balance between justice and ruthlessness that made his authority absolute. Robb understood that a king's strength lay not only in armies or dragons, but in his ability to see the game before it began, to anticipate the moves of every lord, spy, and rival, and to respond with intelligence rather than impulse. Every victory, every reform, and every alliance was part of a web of power so intricate that the very idea of opposing him became unthinkable. In King's Landing, Robb restructured the governance of the realm to reflect both efficiency and stability. The Iron Throne, once a symbol of death, ambition, and betrayal, became a seat of calculated power. Lannister influence, while diminished, was carefully monitored, their remaining resources neutralized or absorbed into Robb's loyal network. The Southern Lords, who had once doubted the North's strength, now acknowledged his wisdom, aligning their armies, finances, and resources to serve the Wolf King's vision of a unified Westeros. Even minor houses, who had been historically opportunistic, found it safer and more profitable to pledge loyalty than to resist. Robb's justice was swift but fair, his reforms practical yet enduring, and his presence a constant reminder that the Wolf King was both protector and predator, ruling with an intelligence and ruthlessness that had become legendary. His family remained the heart of his power. Sansa, with her unmatched acumen in politics and diplomacy, ensured that Robb's decisions were interpreted wisely and that potential alliances and betrayals were understood before they could affect the realm. Arya's presence remained a shadowed threat to any who considered treachery, and Tallis's counsel provided the human element that kept Robb's strategic mind from becoming purely cold and calculating. Together, they formed a triumvirate of influence and strength, ensuring that every action taken by the Wolf King had both precision and foresight. The Stark family, united as never before, had become the backbone of his rule, their presence amplifying the reach and inevitability of his authority. Even the threat of Daenerys Targaryen, once potentially catastrophic, had been mitigated through a combination of negotiation, anticipation, and subtle pressure. Robb had recognized early that outright confrontation with dragons was dangerous, and so he chose to contain her influence, turning potential warfare into leverage for diplomacy. Over time, Daenerys herself acknowledged the genius of his strategy, understanding that the Wolf King's foresight and dominance were forces even fire could not easily overcome. Through a mixture of respect, fear, and practicality, Robb ensured that Westeros would not be torn apart by new invasions, and he used his victories to further strengthen the unity of the kingdoms under his rule. With threats neutralized, Robb's attention turned to the people. He rebuilt war-torn villages, secured trade routes, and implemented fair justice systems, ensuring that loyalty to him was reinforced by prosperity and protection. The common folk, who had once suffered under corruption and endless war, now looked to the Wolf King as both guardian and ruler. His reputation was no longer simply a story of battlefield victories, it was a living reality, tangible in the safety, order, and prosperity of the realm. Stories of Robb Stark spread far and wide, whispered in awe and respect, a testament to the power of a boy who had survived betrayal and loss to become the most formidable king Westeros had ever seen. Even as the realm stabilized, Robb never allowed complacency. He understood that the nature of power was to be tested endlessly, and that vigilance was the key to survival. Minor rebellions were swiftly neutralized, and alliances constantly reassessed to ensure loyalty and stability. His army, intelligence network, and diplomatic reach were all maintained at peak effectiveness, ensuring that he remained not only the ruler in name, but the uncontested force that shaped the fate of Westeros. The Wolf King's mind was always active, anticipating threats before they emerged, and turning potential challenges into opportunities for consolidation, expansion, and legacy building. In the end, Robb Stark achieved what few could have imagined: the unification of Westeros under a ruler whose genius, strategy, and ruthlessness were unmatched. His enemies either bent to his will or were removed from the political landscape. The people, seeing the benefits of stability, loyalty, and justice, supported him, and his family, now inseparable from the mechanisms of power, ensured that every corner of the kingdom remained under his careful supervision. Robb's legend as the unstoppable Wolf King was complete, yet even in his triumph, he remained vigilant, aware that the nature of power demanded constant attention, adaptation, and foresight. He had survived the impossible, outmaneuvered the greatest threats, and risen to become a king whose authority, intellect, and dominance would be remembered for generations. And so Robb Stark, the boy who had once faced betrayal and death, now ruled not only through fear or might, but through strategy, foresight, and the unbreakable bond of family. Westeros, long fractured and torn by ambition, had found in him a ruler who was unstoppable, unyielding, and unassailable, a Wolf King whose influence would endure far beyond his lifetime, shaping the history of the Seven Kingdoms forever. Yet as Robb gazed across the lands he had united, he knew that rulership was a living challenge. There would always be whispers in the shadows, threats over the horizon, and new alliances to navigate. For Robb Stark, being a king was not merely a reward, it was an endless game, one he was uniquely equipped to play and win every single day.